The highly anticipated 15th BRICS Summit begins today at the Sandton Convention Centre in Johannesburg. South Africa is hosting the three-day summit under the theme BRICS and Africa, a partnership for mutual accelerated growth, sustainable development and inclusive multilateralism. Plenty of themes in that theme. One of the mandates of the conference is to create a global society among BRICS nations. So let's bring in a senior researcher at the SA Institute of International Affairs, Gustavo De Carvalho, joins us this morning. Gustavo, it's always great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for coming on. Big week for BRICS, big week for South Africa, and a massive week for Cyril Ramaphosa as well.
Absolutely. I think this has been probably one of the most symbolic BRICS summits that we've had in a long time. BRICS was created in 2009, and since we've seen quite a strong space for institutionalization, for strengthening of its voice, and particularly with the discussions that we're having this week specifically about expansion of BRICS and the potential expansion of BRICS, but discussions around the potential use of alternative currencies within the context of BRICS, all of those will have quite a major impact for the structure of BRICS moving forward. And I think that it will be very important for us to follow what decisions are made and how the group is going to look like in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we were discussing this morning the response by BRICS nations to the question around reliable energy supply here in South Africa. BRICS nations saying that's really not what they want to focus on. In fact, what they want to focus on is BRICS nations coming together and investing in each other's economies. What do you make of that kind of response to what is an incredibly important question here at home?
Absolutely. And I think we need to be cautious when we look into what BRICS is, but also what BRICS is not. We haven't really seen BRICS historically playing a major role in terms of fostering trade between its members. Of course, it does have an impact in terms of how countries interact with one another, but we don't have enough mechanisms really to strengthen that connection between countries. And I think that largely becomes part of the bilateral discussions that President Ramaphosa will be having with all of the BRICS presidents that will be in South Africa in the coming days.
Yeah.
But I think there is also an important mechanism now in terms of what has BRICS been doing. And I think particularly in the last couple of years, we've seen the group expanding its interests as well, not only in terms of the members. And to that regard, it became seen for many developing countries as a really important vehicle, as a potential vehicle for them to increase their voice in global affairs. So when we see the countries that are aiming to apply, they're all more or less similar categories of countries. They are middle powers, regionally relevant with important middle income economies. So in that sense, we should really expect majority of the big announcements that will be happening this week are in relation to the expansion, but also in relation to issues around currencies. And that in itself is expected to have some kind of an impact when it comes to trade, especially with currency, where countries in the global south are looking to diversify their options when it comes to trading, but also reducing risks that are quite inherent in a very polarized global environment.
Yeah. I mean, having said that, Gustavo, it's very clear that ordinary small business in South Africa actually expect a lot from the BRICS Summit. I mean, we had a number of sessions leading up to the summit kicking off today. For example, we had a dialogue hosted by the Township Economic Commission of South Africa, the first dialogue for that commission. There's a real expectation that what happens in these discussions over the next few days will filter down to our economies on the ground.
And they are absolutely right. I think this is part of any reflection that any government would do when joining an international organization. And a group like BRICS, that it's by definition fairly loose, fairly unstructured in many ways. We don't even have a treaty that was signed in terms of creating BRICS. But I think BRICS also has, despite a lot of its limitations, it has a lot of vehicles and platforms in which enables other actors, whether they're business, whether they're civil society. It's still, I think it could still be improved a lot, but we're looking now, for instance, in Midrand, the Business Council of BRICS, companies from all of the BRICS members being present in there and having discussions around how to strengthen their relationship, something to what the Chinese often call as the people-to-people relationship. We've seen over the year a number of events related to participation of business, but also civil society through BRICS Civic, BRICS Academic, youth summits for BRICS. We are going to see for the first time the results of the youth summits being presented to heads of states. So I think as the time progresses, BRICS starts becoming more and more sophisticated in the way in which it's structured. And I think it potentially can bring some direct benefits for society. But for that to happen, I think it is important that we're having conversations like this, where the population is well informed, the population understands what BRICS can do, but also noting there is a lot of limitations. We do need to also manage our expectations to note that BRICS is not a panacea, is not the only entry point of foreign policy of South Africa, and should be seen in that regard. That it's a caution optimism about the group, but I think it does provide, especially in the more democratic countries of BRICS, or the IBSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa, where civil society is far more dynamic and quite loud, actually. They can have, through the role that they play in society, they can play potentially a really important role moving forward. Yeah,
it sounds like the issue of partnerships will be an important one over the course of the summit, between government, between the private sector. And I wonder how you would gauge the importance of the civil society role, which you've already mentioned, in these kinds of partnerships.
Civil society largely plays a small role within BRICS, and I think despite many of the structures being very interesting and very useful, we would expect a much stronger role played by civil society in South Africa, considering how important civil society is for the overall developments within the country. And I think there is a number of examples that show how civil society could have played a stronger role. One of them is accreditation. There is no accreditation specifically for civil society. Many civil society had to join through media and with the support of media, I think also showing much of that connection between different societal groups. But to a certain extent, I think the number of parallel events that we've seen in Johannesburg this week, the number of attention, the pressure points that many are making, not only on issues that are related specifically to BRICS, but also on issues that are of interest to civil society as a whole. So my expectation moving forward, and especially when BRICS is hosted by one of its three more democratic countries, is that BRICS creates a better entry point for civil society organizations to engage. We've seen a number of government officials already very engaging quite actively in the last couple of months with civil society groups, but it would be important that some of these developments that are very much happening at the national level should actually be scaled up and actually become much more inclusive and potentially strengthening the role of BRICS Civic that usually gathers civil society organizations to play a much more relevant role, not only within its own meetings that precedes the developments of the summits, but also in particular to ensure that they have a voice, and a very important voice within the political debates that happens during the summits every year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are the kinds of organizations typically that would have their finger on the pulse, right, of real issues affecting a country. Gustavo, as we round off our conversation this morning, what would the success of this summit look like for you?
There will be a number of elements that will show a degree of success of the summit. One, regarding to the expansion, I don't think necessarily at this stage we would necessarily need to announce which countries would be joining, but what would be very important is that a very clear process is defined, the timelines, the criteria, the understanding of what type of countries would be joining BRICS, but particularly what would be the impact on the group, its decision making, and its own relevance internationally. There will be some discussions, very initial discussions regarding the use of alternative currencies in trade, and particularly discussions around enabling countries to trade within their own currencies in very special situations. I think it's not about replacing the US dollar, it's not about replacing our own national economies, it's really a very specific mechanisms. And I think for those 8 countries that went to Ukraine and Russia 2 months ago for the Africa Peace Initiative, there will be very important moments for follow-up discussions with Minister Lavrov of Russia, but also with President Putin via VTC, really where we see it. If we look into President Ramaphosa's speech 2 nights ago, we're starting to see African countries putting pressure into the two parties to ensure that we have some some tangible results. And in that case, President Ramaphosa mentioned 3 of those that will be very important when it relates to the role of the children in Russia and all of the issues that eventually led to the indictment of Vladimir Putin, the issues regarding war prisoners, and finally an issue that is very important for African countries. It was a very important point and probably a very divisive point also in St. Petersburg last month in the Russia-Africa Summit that relates to the issue about grains and the access of trade within the Black Sea.
Gustavo De Carvalho, pleasure talking to you this morning, sir. Thanks for outlining some of the big issues we need to keep our focus on as the BRICS Summit kicks off in Sandton this morning. He is a senior researcher at the SA Institute of International Affairs.